You are listening to the Enormocast.
Yeah, Sportiva is losing its edge.
Losing its edge.
The mandala is losing its edge.
No edge. No edge? More fun. More fun.
The kids are wearing them in France and in London. I was there when Keenan Takahashi tried on the mandala for the first time. I said, man, that's a heck of a mustache. I've heard you have a closet full of every great shoe that Sportiva has ever made, even a retro pair of Megas.
The future has no edge.
I once used a Sportiva mandala to drink Baileys from a shoe while sitting under Sleepwalker, sending it before anyone else, after an all-night rave in Las Vegas. I've never been wrong. I used to work in a climbing gym.
Optimize performance.
Facilitating fluidity. Minimal materials. Sticky coated toe box. Supreme grip.
No edge, more fun.
10 hoot. All right, cans and bottles, fall in. Barring any sort of unforeseen epic, forest pivot, or extended chit-chat in parking lot, our climbers are due back to camp any minute. And since we've been nestled here in this Yeti Tundra cooler, chilled and thrilled, we are poised to offer timely refreshment to these certainly knackered and thirsty climbers. As we know, whether they sent or got bent, stumbling back into camp after yet another best day ever and enjoying an ice-cold libation from this here Tundra cooler is one of the true pleasures in life. Are you cold drinks ready to do your part?
Si, senor.
I don't want to die.
What was that, Raspberita?
I don't want my can ripped open and my insides poured into someone's mouth, sir.
Son, I understand your concern, but we've been putting this here Yeti Tundra cooler for a singular, honorable purpose. That is to give cool, refreshing comfort to our climbers. Should one wish to slake their thirst with your syrupy and artificially tainted insides, then it's a sacrifice you were born to make. Just consider yourselves lucky that you're inside this here Yeti Tundra cooler. Any other icebox and we'd be warm and stale and likely dishonorably poured out after one sip. Yeti has always backed up their products with years of testing, re-engineering, and upgrading to arrive at the majestic Tundra cooler. In my sudsy opinion, every climber owes it to their provisions to go to Yeti.com or a reputable outdoor retailer and check out a Tundra cooler. Stay cool with Yeti.
We gotta get
Listen, where you playing in town? You playing here?
We're doing the Enormo Dome, whatever it is. It's terrific.
Oh,
It's
yeah,
a
big
house. We
place
sold
that
it out.
side of town. That's a
Very
big
nice.
place. You sold
What's
it
that,
out.
20,000
seats?
We really should.
The hell are you doing? I couldn't sleep. I'm checking the ropes. There was a frayed end on your rope, and I'm cutting it out.
Good weather, bad weather. No, later, anytime. Good time.
Today's show is brought to you by Black Diamond Equipment, La Sportiva, and with support from Maxim Ropes. Maxim has been keeping the Enormocast off the deck since 2012.
And now, we can also thank the chill folks at Yeti. And don't forget our charter sponsor, Bonfire Coffee. Go to bonfirecoffee.com and enter Enormo at checkout to get a great deal on great coffee and to support the Enormocast.
And now back to the show.
Hello and welcome to the Enormocast. This is your host, Chris Kalous. It is September 24th, 2024, about 9:30 here in Colorado, and this is episode 293 of the Enormocast, a conversation with the quad father, Jim Ewing. You heard that right. Jim Ewing has a legitimate claim to inventing the quad anchor, which we get into in the beginning of the podcast, but that's not really what the podcast is about. The podcast actually is about Jim Ewing's long climbing career leading up to a lapse in judgment, a bit of complacency, and a 60-foot ground fall, and what happened after that. But until we get to that part of the interview, Jim and I are racing to get our paperwork filled out to trademark the Quadfather. But do you know what else is coming up? I've been invited to the Banff Mountain Film Festival at the end of October. I kind of feel like I've arrived. It only took 13 years and nearly 300 episodes. But yeah, I've been invited to the preeminent mountaineering and climbing media event in the world. I think that's easy to say. I only have a small part in it. I'm going to be doing a live interview with Barry Blanchard, who's never been on the show. I've come close, but never pulled it off. So we're going to get that recorded, hopefully, and have it out into your ears as well. My little part of the festival is on Saturday, the 2nd of November, 11 a.m. over at the Banff Center. You can check out the schedule for the whole darn thing at banffcenter.ca. If you are in attendance, come by and see the live interview. If you're a Bow Valley resident, it's free, so come on over. And if you live in Banff, well, you've lucked out somewhere along the line. The stuff during the day is mostly free. My thing's free, so come check it out. There's going to be so many cool people there. So many of my friends, frankly. So I'm going to be hunting interviews. I'm going to be having a lot of fun. And they're giving me a hotel room. And I'll tell you what, I'm at the point in my life where a clean hotel room is heaven. I don't know why, but yeah, checking into somewhere that somebody else is going to clean up just feels really great. And I remember back to being a dirtbag and every once in a while splurging for some crummy hotel room that just felt like the Taj Mahal, getting out of the elements, getting cleaned off, watching some TV. You ever do that? You ever come in from like Red Rocks and get a hotel room? Like at the Mirage, like on a Tuesday night for half off. I don't know. Everybody's vans are so nice. I don't think that feels the same anymore. Or Monticello, Utah. I tell you what, the Super 8 in Monticello can feel like the Pleasure Dome after like a month in the sand out there at Indian Creek. Especially like late November, December. Ooh, yeah. Anywho, let's get on to this interview with Jim Ewing. This is one of those interviews that becomes this very interesting web. Jim has been a prominent climber in the Northeast for decades, going back to the 80s in North Conway. He also worked for Sterling Rope for many years, so he was in the industry. He climbed with all sorts of legends, including Hugh Herr, which decades later, his friendship with Hugh Herr would unfold in very surprising ways after Jim was involved in a terrible accident in Cayman Brac that profoundly changed his body and his life. But first, we're going to talk about the quad anchor. So let's get to the interview with the Quadfather, Jim Ewing.
Anthropologists tell us that since the beginning of time, the hunt for three essential things has ruled primitive primates: food, shelter, and bomber protection for thin cracks. Today, before dawn, we stashed a pile of Black Diamond Camelot Z4s at the base of the thin and fierce magic line to see what kind of species we could lure in. Now we wait. Oh my goodness, our first taker is a beautiful Honol erectus. Just look at those lats. Honol erectus is known for foregoing protection altogether, but when in need, it goes for the lightweight versatility of the Camelot Z4 every time. Just magnificent. Wait, what's this approaching the crack? Ah, an absolutely stunning female Hazelonymus intrepidae. These awesome and fearless creatures choose the Black Diamond Z4 for its low profile and holding power. Well, our experiment today has once again proven that the Z4 from Black Diamond is the smooth action, low profile, and lightweight small cam of choice for species of trad climbers all over the globe. So head to your local shop or blackdiamondequipment.com to see these essential survival tools. And if you listen carefully, you may even hear the somber call of a Didier Bertaudet echo from the cliffs.
The first thing is, and we have to get this out of the way, because it's burning at me, is that you have laid claim to the origin of the quad anchor, right? Which
yes,
honestly is a dubious claim because lots of people
doubt it.
I'm not saying I doubt it, but I'm saying that there's someone right now who's going like, no, wait a minute, I invented that, or like my friend Al totally was doing that like in the 80s or whatever. So tell me.
So to be fair,
me your claim.
To be fair,
if you were in the patent office right now, what would you say?
To be fair, I may not have been the original creator, although I think I am.
Right.
So back in the late 90s, John Long was working on his anchors book, and he asked me to do some testing on the cordelette because a friend of his, mathematician Rich Goldstone, had told him that, well, the cordelette doesn't equalize. Like mathematically, it does not equalize. And if you know anything about physics, you can look at a cordelette system, the traditional method of having a master knot with different length legs. You'll know instantly, oh yeah, that can't equalize, because if you have different length legs, they're all gonna stretch to different amounts. And the shortest leg is always going to reach its maximum stretch first, and that one will take the majority of the load. So I set up in the lab to kind of test that, and sure enough, yeah, things do not equalize with a cordelette in that fashion. Being kind of a ADHD brain kind of guy, I was like, well, how can I make this equalize? And so I just kind of started playing around with things, and having been around during the origins of the AMGA, I was like, okay, well, it's got to be redundant. It's got to be simple. It's got to be, all of the acronyms serene. So I just started playing around with tying some slings. I took a double length sling, like a 4-footer, doubled it up, tied some stopper knots in it. And I was like, oh, well, with the stopper knots in it, you have 4 strands in the middle, which came up with the name quad. And if you just clip any 2 of those strands, then you have a super strong, self-equalizing, redundant, captive anchor. And so when I was reporting all my findings to John Long, I said, well, just so you know, I was playing around with this thing that I'm calling the quad, and this thing equalizes great and is the serene acronym, ticks all the boxes. And I think he included that in the book, although he was more excited about using this other version called the Equalette, which I also created that as well. And I think in the book, he gives me credit for that, but then he gives a brief mention to the quad. But for some reason, the quad just took off in popularity, and it's taught by the AMGA now. It's become the standard 2-bolt anchor system. I don't know if that's true, if it's the standard, but it seems to show up everywhere.
Sure feels like it.
Yeah, it shows up everywhere, and it's equally maligned and loved. And
I think I'm the only one maligning it, and it's all a joke.
Yeah. Well, for me, like to be fair, I created it and named it kind of jokingly. I was like, well, we'll just call this the quad. And after that book came out, after the Anchors book came out, people across the country were just coming up to me randomly at climbing areas and showing me their self-equalizing, redundant systems. And I was like, oh, yeah, that's great. Yeah, that really worked. But
like
then,
as a challenge? Were they like
I don't know.
It was like a dance fight where they're like, I got something better. Like, I'll show you this thing. Or what?
Pretty much. It was like, I gotta show you my system. And I think Super Topo was really big at the time. Rockclimbing.com, like the discussions on there were just endless, deep, angry, how the internet is, like just angry, stupid discussions over the minutia of it. And I kind of wrote it all off as like, I hope I never hear about any of this stuff ever again.
Yet here I am,
and then
drilling you on
it. When Mo and I were kind of prepping to go to the Lotus Flower Tower, we were in, was it 11 Mile Canyon in Colorado? And we were at the base of some crag, and this dude comes over and was like, "Are you guys locals?" We're like, "Well, some of us are, some of us aren't." "Okay, who can tell me about the quad?" And I was like, what does being local have to do with that? But also I was like, well, you've come to the right place. I like it. It just follows me everywhere.
Was that like some challenge? Like,
I don't know.
Can you tell me about the quad? Or was he like,
it was a new climber.
Oh, okay.
Newer climber from Texas.
Right. So he legitimately wanted some info.
He wanted info about like, have we set this up correctly or something?
Okay.
I was like, I don't know what being local has to do with that, but okay, like we can help you.
So you mentioned going into the lab. Who are you that you go into? When you see a climbing problem, you go into the lab. Like that has something to do with your background as something, right?
So
I don't have a lab.
So the reason John Long contacted me is because I worked for Sterling Rope for 23 years as a product developer and engineer. Actually, I was kind of really busy at the time, and I told the owner of Sterling, I was like, I don't really have time for this. And she just said, well, just make it happen. Like, just do what you can, make it happen. And it ended up kind of snowballing, and I did a lot of testing, had a few different statisticians analyzing data, and then me kind of, like I said, the ADHD brain, I was like, oh, well, I'm going to side quest this, and I'm going to come up with something that will actually equalize and tick all the boxes of redundancy and security and all that. Simplicity. And out of that came the Equalette and the quad.
All right, I'm giving it to you. I think your claim is legitimate. The court has determined your legitimacy until we hear something better than that.
I can go back and look at John's book because I know he gives me credit for the Equalette, which funny thing is he was going to call it the Jimbalette, and I was like, I will fucking hunt you down and murder you in your sleep. But that's his kind of humor.
Get in line.
Yeah.
I might have to get in line with old John Long. But I watched a documentary that you suggested called Augmented to prepare for this, which was an awesome doc and quite moving. And that's when I kind of realized, like, wow, this guy is he's been around the block. I then talked to some other people that know you, and oh yeah, Jim is not like, that's not the sum of who he is as a climber. The sum is much, much bigger than that. So can you do that sort of question about like what kind of climber you are, and talk a little bit about your career without we don't have to go minute by minute since your birth, but tell us what kind of climber you are.
What kind of climber I am is I'm still trying to figure that out. Like, and maybe that's why
I've changed radically.
Yeah, maybe that's why I have such longevity in it. But how I got started, if you talk to my mom, I got started at like age 2. I used to climb onto the roof of the house and sit up there because I remember I liked the view. She tells this story of me sitting on the roof of the garage, and some random woman stops and says, "Ma'am, your son is up on the roof." And my mom had tried to coax me down with cookies or something earlier, and I just said no. And so she told this woman, "Yes, I know he's there, and he can stay there for all I care," because I was not cooperating.
Where is this?
This was in southern New Hampshire, in Hampton, New Hampshire.
Oh, okay.
Which is where I mostly grew up.
She would have called the social services on your mom.
Yeah,
everybody's all nosy like that now, even in New Hampshire, probably.
Yeah, for sure. When we were kids, things were way different. Like, I was a total free range kid, and just come home when the street lights turn on, and you don't even have to be within voice range of home. Just come home when the street lights come on, if that. But how I kind of got interested in climbing was I have two older brothers, and I used to sit in their bedroom, like flipping through old copies of National Geographic. And I came across a couple of Everest expedition issues. One was the 53 expedition with Sir Edmund Hillary, and then another was the 63 U.S. expedition. And then there was also some, I think it was Doug Robinson's article about Half Dome by Fair Means. I think that might have been the name of it. But it was about climbing Half Dome clean, without the use of pitons.
Did you ever come across the Titan one?
The Titan.
It's like a 1963 or 4 issue with Core on the Titan.
Oh yes, yep, for sure.
Yeah, because that's one that I ran into, was very big deal in my climbing development, was finding that one actually.
Yeah, around that time, my oldest brother was kind of getting into climbing, and he was buying climbing gear, and he was in high school, I think, at the time. And a guy named, you might know this name, a guy named Todd Swain was also at that high school and was a climber.
He went on to be a big Joshua Tree guy, right?
Yeah, he was the ranger at Joshua Tree. And
ranger and wrote guidebooks and all that stuff, right?
Yeah, he wrote one of the guidebooks for Red Rocks. He's written guidebooks for the Gunks. He was a ranger at the Mohonk Preserve for the Gunks for a long time. So Todd went to the same high school that my brothers and I went to, and my brother climbed with him a little bit. So my brothers and I were all born in California. We have friends and relatives in California. So we were out in California for like Christmas break one year, and we went to the movies and we saw the Eiger Sanction when it was in theaters. So I have a particular affinity with your podcast because I was like, I know these clips. I've heard all this. I've seen this in the theaters. It's just stuff like that is just stuck in my memory. And then through that, I kind of became obsessed with reading things about the Eiger. So I read, while I was in junior high, I was reading the Eiger Wall of Death and the White Spider, the John Harlan biography, Straight Up, Life and Death of a Climber. I was in junior high at the time, well, what the kids call middle school now. I was into all the traditional sports as a kid. I played football and hockey and baseball. And as I got more and more kind of focused on climbing, I started giving up those sports because they were kind of getting in the way of going climbing. And once I got my driver's license, it was over. I gave up everything. Was going climbing in North Conway, New Hampshire, like every weekend I could. A couple days after I got my driver's license, the first thing I did was drive the 2 hours to North Conway. I bought a pair of Ascenders, and I went out and after reading Royal Robbins' Advanced Rockcraft, which included a section on rope soloing, I went and rope soloed Thin Air on Cathedral, which is a big classic 5.5, 5.6, and it was equally terrifying and just completely captivated me. Like this is it. This is what I want to do for the rest of my life.
Yeah, and at some point, you became friends with people like Hugh Herr, and that says to me that you sort of rose to this community of really good climbers. But it just says to me that you became part of the fabric, to where you were rubbing elbows with that echelon of climbers. Which is not to say you were some sort of elitist, but it just shows that you were dedicated and hanging around and became a person that was around enough to start knowing the people who are really involved in the situation. So tell me about that next level. Maybe fast forward to like really getting into the climbing community versus being this kid who goes and solos something all by himself because he probably doesn't know anybody in North Conway, kind of thing.
Yeah, I didn't really know anybody there. But I had been kind of haunting the cliffs as much as I could. And I knew the names from reading the guidebooks. And also back then, Climbing Magazine had a segment that was called, I think, Base Camp. And in Base Camp, they would basically report all the new routes that people were doing and attach the names and the grades of these things and who did the first ascent. So I graduated high school in 82, and I originally didn't really have a plan to go to college, but then I discovered that there was a school in Maine that did an outdoor education degree. And I applied to Unity College in Unity, Maine, went to school there. But during the summers between school years, I would spend my summers in North Conway and hunt around, either try to find places to camp or sleep on the floors in friends' apartments, people that I've just met. There was a crew of us who, for a while, we lived in John Bouchard's cabin. He had bought this land between Cathedral Ledge and Whitehorse Ledge, and he built a little cabin there, and you could stay there. I think it was like $3 a night or something. So there was probably like a dozen of us living in there, that in this cabin that really was only meant for 2 or 3 people. That was the base. I lived there for a while with a guy named Randy Radcliff, super strong ice climber who went on to do things in the Canadian Rockies with Mark Twight. And he's also owner, operator of Cold World backpacks.
Right. And an artist that everybody's seen, even if you didn't know. Seen some of his kind of woodcut block looking. Yes. I don't know how he actually makes them, but
he was dabbling in that early on, and then we all kind of got jobs as instructors in either EMS or IME or like all the various climbing schools. And we had some money. We got apartments, and he kind of always lived in the basements of all these apartments because that would be the cheapest rent. And he started doing the block prints while living in those places, and just book upon book upon book of sketches, and his artwork was just amazing. Randy and I, and then later Hugh, lived in this cockroach-ridden chalet near the cliffs. The place was horrendous, but it was cheap. And I only lived there during the summers, and Hugh was there, I think, during the one winter and one summer that he was working for Wild Things. I don't think I ever actually went out climbing with Hugh at the time, but we kind of became the climbing community of North Conway. We embedded ourselves there and climbed with people like John Bouchard and Joe Lentini, Randy Radcliff I mentioned. Jerry Handren eventually moved to town, became a guide for IMCS. Nick Yardley came around, and a whole bunch of others. Stevie Damboys. The climbing community in North Conway was pretty tight-knit, but people kind of always filtered in and filtered out. So Hugh, he filtered in to basically come back and, I don't know, I think maybe slay some dragons that he had resulting from his accident. And at the time, he was a bilateral amputee climbing 513. Like, he was probably one of the strongest climbers in the world. So it was through that relationship with Hugh and hanging out with him, seeing him climb, seeing him ride bikes, run, do whatever. After I had my accident, the idea of amputation wasn't quite so terrifying, which is funny because prior to that, the thought of losing a finger even was kind of terrifying. Like, I once cut my knuckle to the bone while working on my truck, and I was like, I have permanently handicapped myself. My finger doesn't work right anymore. It doesn't bend all the way. It doesn't have the strength it used to. So I was like devastated, maybe coming to grips with mortality or something. I don't know.
Well, TC's normalized climbing with finger loss. So
right.
As we know as well. When you're talking about Conway and the climbing community, and this is so typical when I talk to male climbers of that era, it's just like, yeah, me and the boys lived here, and me and the boys lived there, and me and the boys, battled cockroaches in this cabin, and it's like, I think it's of the times, we've gotten used to much more parity in the sport, but when I joke, I'm like, yeah, it wasn't like that 25, 30 years ago. Like, right. I think people don't quite understand how much it wasn't like that. And in a place like North Conway, maybe even more so. But you did manage to have some sort of social life outside climbing as well.
I think the reason I didn't really cover that part is because the story of how my wife and I met and our eventual marriage.
Courtship
is kind of a wild story all on its own. But it also kind of goes together with the hanging with the boys in North Conway, because there was a phase where, well, sport climbing was really just getting started. And so like focused training for climbing was getting started. So we would do things like we would work all day, banging nails, doing whatever. We all had various jobs. Then we'd go to the climbing gym, work out, lift weights, climb the walls, do whatever. But then for aerobic workout, there was this really cool club in Portland, Maine, which was like an hour and a half away. It was like a techno dance, hip hop, industrial house music kind of place. It was a predominantly gay dance club. So my buddies and I, we were driving down there like 2 or 3 nights a week to get our aerobic workout in. We would just go in and just jump around dancing like fools until 2 or 3 in the morning. And then I would drive.
The gay dance club aerobic training program.
Yeah, it was.
I haven't seen that one online. It's a niche that you could fill.
Well, I mean, the gays have the best music. Like they had the best dance club music. It was incredible. So I would leave there, drive to the job site, sleep in my car, get up, bang nails again the next day, and just, start the whole process all over again. Sometimes we would actually go out climbing instead of going to Portland. So it was at that club that I met my wife. And over the course of several months of kind of not dating her or even really talking to her, I think one day I eventually got the courage to kind of ask her for her phone number. And this was pre-cell phone era. And eventually I gave her a call and we had a first date. Our first date was climbing, because when we first met her, she asked me, "What do you do?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean, what do I do? What do I do for work, or what do I do?" And she kind of gave me the sideways look of like, what are you talking about? Like, what is this? I said, "Well, I'm a climber. I'm a rock climber and ice climber." And so she's like, kind of, that sounds cool. And I said, would you ever want to try that? And she said, yeah, maybe. So eventually, long story
it's
short.
It's like the only card we have.
Yeah.
Back then. Like, it's all you got. If you can entice them to go climbing, that's it.
Yeah, there were so few climbers back then. It was like definitely still very much a fringe element.
These two things we've covered are important, and we're burying the lead here about the foot. But the two things we've covered are important is A, you get married, eventually start a family, and B, this just normal haphazard climbing friendship with Hugh Herr comes back big time later in your life. It seems like, you had that progressive life of, getting a real job, even though it was for Sterling, and maybe you thought like, oh, it'll be cool. It's like a climbing company. And then you work your ass off and get burned out, but obviously stay with them for a long time and start a family. And like all climbers, whatever happens, the climbing starts to take a backseat to a certain extent, but you start climbing with your family.
My wife and I would go on climbing trips and sport climbing trips mostly, because she didn't really care for getting multi-pitches off the ground. Yeah, we continued traveling across the country, going to Europe, sport climbing, doing whatever. 10 years into the marriage, we have a kid, and I continue climbing. Kathy did a sudden change of careers and went back to school for nursing. I was able to, because I was working at Sterling, I could still go climbing, and eventually I could bring our child out to the cliffs as well and continue sport climbing. And my child is non-binary, but as a toddler, as a young kid, pre-adolescent, she was a she. So I don't know how to phrase that when I'm talking about them in history.
I mean, we could just use they, now that you've explained it.
So eventually they became old enough to go climbing, and we would go climbing as family. We went to Yosemite, we went to Tuolumne, Colorado, City of Rocks, a bunch of different places. There were a couple of times that Maxine and I went off on climbing trips without my wife because my wife was still working. So we went to Wild Iris, we went to Ten Sleep. So the climbing continued. Guys that I climb with locally in Maine kept trying to talk me into going someplace warm for a winter climbing trip where our kids could spend time in the water, go someplace Caribbean. So my friend Steve had heard about Cayman Brac, and kind of between he and my wife, they kind of wore me down about going to the tropics, going to the Caribbean, because I just figured I'm not a warm weather person. Like hot, humid weather just destroys me. So I didn't have much interest in it. And when I stepped off
You're
the plane,
proper Mainer.
Yeah, proper Mainer. I stepped off the plane in Grand Cayman and I nearly fell over from the heat. I was like, holy shit, I am going to fucking die here. Like this is more than I can handle. But eventually, you acclimatize to that stuff and you can function. So we actually went climbing on Cayman Brac. It wasn't terrible. It was pretty decent. But the snorkeling was phenomenal. And I was like, I just want to stay down longer. I want to be able to stay down longer. So after that trip in 2011, I came back to Maine and my daughter and I both got scuba certified, vowing to return to Cayman Brac and go scuba diving. So in December of 2014, we went down before Christmas, and just my daughter and I went down before Christmas. My wife had to work on Christmas Day, so she was going to come down the day after Christmas. So Maxine and I went scuba diving on Christmas Day and just absolutely enjoyed it. It was the best diving ever. Still think those first few dives down there were like some of my favorite ever. And then the next day, the 26th, Boxing Day, we went to go climbing with some friends over on the north side of the island at a place called Dixon's Wall that I hadn't been to. And my wife was going to be flying in later that day. So we really only had a few hours to go climb, and then we had to run to the airport. So we did a few climbs, some warm-ups or whatever, just some 10s there. There weren't a lot of well-established moderate climbs there at the time. Eventually, it came down to, let's just do this one last climb, and then we got to go to the airport. So it was a thing called Dixon's Delight, 11B maybe. I don't remember. And Maxine being significantly lighter than me, I had to anchor her to the ground, and the only place I could do that was down this little hill and kind of back from the cliff a little bit. And the first bolt was kind of low on the route, and then it goes up to this big overhanging head wall, up some tufas, but I had stopped on this ledge that was not a completely no hands ledge, but it was a pretty good rest where you could just kind of balance there. And I don't know what happened, but I just had a brain fart and it stepped off the ledge, just wasn't paying attention. And because of the way that I had set everything up, and this is the big key, the thing that people ask me, well, how did your accident happen? I was complacent. I didn't look everything over exactly thoroughly and didn't think about what was going to happen if I did fall on this thing, because I didn't expect to fall on it. But I did fall, and because of the way that I had left the rope, the stack of rope was uphill in front of Maxine, in front of the belayer, in front of the gree-gree. So when I weighted it, the gree-gree locked initially, but because Maxine was anchored to the ground, it pulled her off her feet, and then there was some slack in the system from the recoil, and the gree-gree unlocked. And Maxine held her brake hand as tight as she could, but it was just pulling through her hand and burning it. And eventually she had to just let it go, which at the time Maxine was 13 and had held me on dozens of sport climbing trips, dozens of sport climbing falls, probably hundreds of falls, climbing in the gym, like no problem, definitely knew how to operate a gree-gree. And I had taught her that if a gree-gree doesn't lock, your hands are probably doing something preventing it from locking. So let go of the rope, get your hands away from it, let it lock. So she did that, and because of the arrangement of the ropes, it just ran through the gree-gree, and I just went 60 feet to the ground. And I actually didn't feel like I had hit all that hard. I mean, that was a hard landing, but I was very aware of everything going on. I actually kind of turned as I was falling and made eye contact with another climber who was just arriving at the cliff. And I just stared this guy in the face as I piled into the ground. And I didn't hit my head. I didn't lose consciousness, but I got the wind knocked out of me. And I was kind of laying there on the ground and trying to catch my breath. And I remember telling this guy, his name is Matt Gustafson from Oregon. And I told him, well, as soon as I catch my breath, I want to roll over so I can breathe easier. And so I kind of was not catching my breath very well. And eventually I said, well, I'm going to roll over anyway. And as soon as I tried to roll over, I felt all the bones in my pelvis grind. And I was like, okay, well, that's not happening. And then I said, well, just be aware. I could see that my wrist was at a funny angle. I said, watch out for my wrist. I think it's broken. And he said, yeah, well, your ankle's not looking too great either. So
were you bleeding much?
I was not bleeding anywhere.
Oh, okay.
I had maybe a little bit of a scratch on my wrist or something. Didn't hit my head. Which is really shocking because Cayman Brock is notorious for how sharp the stone is. It's called iron stone. And I sometimes joke that anytime your bare skin touches rock there, you're drawing blood. So the fact that I piled into the ground amongst all these rocks and did not get any cuts was almost unbelievable. And I remember thinking, well, okay, my ankle's broken. I could maybe still go snorkeling for this trip. Climbing is over, but I just had no idea how badly I was really hurt. Eventually, other climbers there went out to the road, called an ambulance, and sent the ambulance in. This cliff is literally in this guy's backyard. It's 2-3 minutes from the road. Ambulance shows up, and I'm telling them all of my injuries. My wrist is broken. My pelvis is broken, my ankle's broken. And they said, okay, we're gonna roll you over. And I said, no, my pelvis is broken. And they tried to roll me over, and I screamed, and I was like, my pelvis is broken. So they went, oh, your pelvis is broken. This is a tiny island, 1,500 people there, permanent residents, if that. They don't deal with this kind of stuff. They put a diaper sling on me and rolled me over, and that was much better, and got me off to the hospital. At the hospital, they didn't want to give me any pain meds because they knew I was going to need surgery. So they were conversing with the hospital over on Grand Cayman, the big hospital. At one point, I said, hey, I feel funny, and I passed out, and it was from the pain. The whole time I was talking clearly and wasn't really in shock, but it was overwhelming amount of pain, and I just shut down. And one of my injuries was my ribs were all separated from my sternum. My sternum, because when I landed, everything, the force was just blasted up into my chest and just blew my chest open. So that injury, when I passed out, what do the nurses typically do to see if you're awake or get a response? They do a sternal rub. They take a knuckle, give you a knuckle right to the sternum and rub it really hard. And I
think my brother used to do that to me.
Yeah. I woke up screaming. I think I swore a few times, and they're very religious there. And they're like, now, Mr. Jim, we're not going to take care of you if you keep using that kind of language. And I was like, I'm sorry. Then they started they cut my harness off of me. They cut my shorts off of me. I begged them not to cut my shorts. They were my favorite shorts. They were going to cut my climbing shoes off, and I begged them not to do that because they're brand new shoes. So just unlace them all the way down to the toe, and then they'll come right off. So they do that. They came right off, and then they threw them in the trash.
It's funny. You're like a total dirtbag climber through and through still.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even at this moment of basically
fighting for your life.
Looking at the end of the tunnel there, you're like, I still got to keep these shorts. I still got, those are new shoes, dog. I don't care how much money I make a year. Retail climbing shoes are expensive.
Right. I don't at this point, I don't even remember what they were, but they were brand new. I think they were 510s or something. So it was at that point that we discovered that I did have one wound, and it was a puncture wound in my heel. And originally I thought, well, maybe that was from a bone going out through the skin. But I later realized that it was actually a rock going in. It went through the shoe and then into my heel. But that was the only open wound that I had out of the whole thing. So eventually they call the Cayman Islands police helicopter to come over and get me. And when they were packaging me up to put me in the helicopter, I thought, oh shit, they put this bubble thing over me. I thought they were going to put me on the outside of the helicopter, and I was like, oh Jesus, I'm going to die on this trip. I'm not going to be able to talk to anybody. I'm going to be outside the helicopter for this 100-mile flight to Grand Cayman, and I'm just going to fucking die out here. But I was totally okay with it. This is what it is. And then once I got to once they started giving me pain meds, things kind of started to get blurry, and the next couple of days were kind of still kind of a mystery to me. And even my wife, who, while I was in the first hospital, I asked them to call the airport, tell my wife to stay on Grand Cayman Island. I will be over shortly. But they didn't catch her in time. She gets off the plane on Cayman Brac, and they call her over and say, your husband's been in an accident. And she thought, well, it had to have been a car accident because Jim doesn't have climbing accidents. And they eventually tell her that, yeah, it was a climbing accident. He's being flown to Grand Cayman. So she gets right back onto the plane that she just got off of and goes to Grand Cayman. Maxine ends up staying on the island for a night, maybe 2 nights, with a friend from Maine who just happened to be there at the same time and took care of Maxine, because Maxine was 13, couldn't drive, had to be dropped off at the airport. So Maxine actually was kind of left with gathering up all of our scuba gear, all our climbing gear, throwing that all into duffel bags and getting that to the airport and getting back over. I mean, that's a lot for a 13-year-old kid to deal with.
And this accident's running through their head the whole time.
Yeah, and dealing with
it must have been a really difficult couple days.
It's turned into a difficult few years. Trauma from that is not, I don't mean to minimize that or brush that off at all. Like that, right? What Maxine went through, I can't imagine. So eventually, I get to Grand Cayman, in the hospital there, and all 3 of us are there. And I went through a couple of surgeries to kind of stabilize some of the injuries, but they're not a level 1 trauma center. So I had to get to the closest level 1 trauma unit, which was in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, which meant my wife had to book and pay for an air ambulance from Grand Cayman to Florida, and they won't leave the ground until they're paid in full. And that was $26,000. So we maxed out a couple credit cards to pull that off. That flight, I didn't realize it at the time because I didn't feel that bad, but probably the closest I came to dying out of the whole thing was during that flight because my blood saturation, oxygen saturation was down in the 60s. And my wife, a nurse, is on board this plane where I've been crammed in there into this little Learjet, all bandaged up with, because of my broken pelvis, I had an erector set bolted into my hips to stabilize those fractures. My wife was watching everything, trying to stay out of the way, but eventually she was like, what are you doing? Like the air ambulance crew was really not up to speed on things. And I probably should have been on a ventilator because my lungs were so badly bruised that my oxygen saturations were really low. And I tell people in the medical world, yeah, my sats were in the 60s. They're like, holy shit. We almost call the crash cart if your sats go into the 80s. So my wife is freaking out. She takes over from the air ambulance crew, and eventually they didn't have the right type of mask. And she takes the mask, gets it on me, and actually tapes and seals it around to try to stabilize my oxygen intake. Then we arrive in Florida. The receiving ambulance is asking for a report. The air ambulance crew doesn't have a report. They don't know what's going on. My wife is like giving them my vitals. And then while she's giving them the report, customs shows up and starts asking for papers. And the air ambulance crew is like, no comprende. So part of me kind of thinks that this whole air ambulance thing was a front for like a drug smuggling operation, because it just didn't seem to like scream, we are a professional air ambulance system here. But customs sees me laying on the tarmac, literally dying in front of them, and they're like, you all can go. So I went, like, they rushed me over to the hospital and then kind of got me straight into surgery. But as they were taking me into surgery, somewhere in South Florida, some dude with a sailboat, towing a sailboat, hits a power line and just like blacks out the whole eastern seaboard of Florida. So they didn't do surgery on me because they won't start surgery on the emergency generators, because if the generators go down, then there's nothing. So they had to wait until the power came back on before they would start the first surgeries and start piecing me back together. And then I spent the next like 3.5 weeks in that hospital getting patched back together, fixing my wrist, my ankle, my pelvis, and whatever else. Eventually, we got another air ambulance to take me back to Maine, and I spent another month in a skilled nursing facility, not getting any more surgeries, but basically just someplace where I could...
Healing.
Yeah, someplace I could kind of heal up a little bit before I could go home. And then eventually I was home, and I was home basically in bed for like 6 months, not really doing much of anything.
Part of the deal I wanted to do is just talk about how experienced a climber you were, and at some point during this process, when does it the sort of what the fuck moment of like, how did I make it this far to have this happen? I heard a little sort of sub story of that when you were talking about the accident of like, how did I get this far? I mean, the complacency, but it must have hit you like a ton of bricks.
Yeah, so at that time I had been climbing for probably already over 40 years and done lots of sketchy, stupid things in the mountains, dangerous things. Even my earliest experiences, like I didn't take real lessons and learn how to place gear. Like this was all trial and error. So to live through all that and then live through all of my other exploits over many decades, cheating death, like kind of all over the place, things that should have killed me. And then I nearly die sport climbing in the Caribbean of all fucking places. Yeah, the irony is not lost on me. So it's like the complacency that's the thing that gets a lot of people. You kind of have one, not a momentary lapse in judgment, but maybe a momentary lapse in awareness of what could potentially happen if this if this is here and this fails, what's going to happen? Like, talking to to Will Gadd about stuff like that. He says he coined the phrase the positive power of negative thinking. Like, what can go wrong? And on that particular day, I didn't think very carefully about what could have gone wrong. Is that what you're looking for that particular
Yeah,
part?
just kind of curious because, and it's not an unusual story. I mean, you're vacation climbing, and so sometimes, people's awareness, like when you walk into the mountains, you mentioned climbing the Canadian Rockies and things like that. It's like, you're on high alert because here we are in this place.
Yeah.
And I think that the complacency is tricky with that. And I've thought a lot about that in my own life. Because I mean, here in Colorado, like nothing's more convenient than climbing in rifle. And,
right.
And I'm surprised actually how few accidents actually go down in that place. Although it requires a skill level, I think that sort of things, but it's an interesting thing of this idea of how safe, sport climbing is or whatever, but it's also this can be this kind of drug that makes you kind of let your guard down in a way.
Yeah. I was kind of lucky that, I don't know if this was in the early days of Mountain Project, but Mo said something during our recent trip to the Bugaboos is, I often think about what people are going to say about me on Mountain Project if this goes wrong. Like, if I get hurt here, what's the Mountain Project gonna say about me? So Mountain Project kind of erupted talking about my accident, and like right away, people all say, oh, the gree had to be loaded backwards or, something of that sort. And there were actually like my climber friends who were there at the scene. That was the first thing they thought. And they checked everything and they're like, everything is perfect. Everything is normal. And it wasn't until I returned home and was back at work that I kind of recreated the accident in our drop tower at work. And it's actually kind of frightening how often you can make a gree fail in that. Mm-hmm. If you have the rope above the gree in front of the gree, how often it won't lock. And in this case, we had a brand new rope, dry treated, thin rope. Like, it was kind of all of the perfect elements for making that thing fail on that particular fall. That particular time.
Right. The thing that's wild in this story is, I mentioned it earlier, is this eventuality of amputation, but that combined with this relationship you have with Hugh Herr. And, we've been talking about Hugh a little bit on the program, but for anyone who doesn't know, that he is basically the best, most accomplished, most visionary creator of prosthesis in the world, MIT lab that does leg prostheses. And so it turns out that you're friends with this man who was a pioneer in it on his own legs. And it turns out that eventually, going back to like a famous Enormocast episode with Craig DiMartino, you're faced with the exact same sort of gallows choice.
Which, by the way, Craig was one of my mentors going into surgery. Like, he was somebody I leaned on pretty heavily about what life is gonna be like for me after amputation, and kind of just. But
you eventually, I mean, you it didn't happen right away, but you had to elect the way he did because it wasn't healing.
I was at 6 months out, and I was doing outpatient physical therapy, like every other day, lots and lots of physical therapy. And my ankle was just not getting better. Everything else kind of healed. The pelvis healed, the wrist healed, my ribs, sternum, everything kind of all slowly got better. Although they were still like somewhat painful. And just existing anywhere was kind of a painful experience. Existing anywhere outside of a wheelchair was kind of painful. I'll fast forward to like a year out from the accident. The local surgeon, foot ankle surgeon, said, well, let's do a CT scan And because I wanted the metal taken out of my ankle because it hurt. Like I could feel it. They doctors all assured me, oh, you can't feel that. And I'm like, no, I'm telling you, I can feel it and it fucking hurts. Like the metal stings. And he was like, yeah, okay, well, we can take it out, but let's do a CT first and see how the bone is healing. The CT showed that the bone was mostly dead. The main fracture was still there. Although I had what was called a Hawkins type 4 fracture, which is like the worst possible fracture of a talus bone. The type 4 means that it's kind of smashed and broken into several small pieces, but the two main pieces were still not healed. The main fracture had not healed, and some of the screws were kind of failing. They were backing out. And I asked that surgeon in Maine about amputation. And he said, oh, no, like, I won't amputate. Like, amputees, they fall down all the time. And, like, I won't do an amputation. But eventually you won't be able to stand the pain anymore, and we'll fuse that, and that'll be that. And I said, well, I had a whole lot of nerve damage in my foot that made the sole of my foot incredibly painful. Like, imagine tearing duct tape off of the most sensitive part of your body like multiple times. That's what it felt like to put my socks on and take my socks off. It was excruciating. So I asked him about the nerve pain. He said, oh, well, I can't do anything about that. That's either in your sacrum or, maybe the nerves were damaged in your foot when they did the surgery, and like there's nothing I can do about it. And to me, that was kind of like not acceptable. And he also told me that, well, eventually we'll fuse your tibiotalar joint. So you won't have any plantar flexion, dorsiflexion anymore. And then eventually in a few years, we'll have to probably fuse your subtalar joint. So you won't have any inversion, eversion anymore. And then eventually we'll have to fuse the talonavicular joint. And ultimately, you're just looking at having this club of a foot that doesn't do much for you. And as a side benefit, the skin is excruciatingly painful. I added that part. So I, as an engineer, I was like, I got to find a way to fix this. And I actually started looking at ways of creating a titanium talus bone that I could have put in there. But I also started researching what existed out there for technology to replace the talus bone or revive the bone. And there's a bunch of different options, but every kind of avenue that I went down ultimately led to, this is not a great solution. This is not a great solution. Everything kind of ended with less than satisfactory results. And so I started looking up a bunch of newer surgeries that could potentially revive the bone, salvage the bone. And then I thought, well, I just kept coming back to, well, Hugh managed just fine as a bilateral amputee. So, and I had, from a distance, I had kind of kept up with what Hugh was doing. I knew that he had gone on to get his PhD in biomedical engineering or something of the sort, and was now a professor at MIT. And I knew he was pretty well connected in kind of the research world and the medical research world. So I gave him a call and kind of caught up a little bit over the years. But he said, well, why don't you come down and we'll talk? So I went down to the lab, his lab at MIT, at the media lab, in January of 2016, because this was now a full year out from the accident, a year and a month. And so we, in our conversation, I said, so I'm hoping that you can connect me to somebody who could rebuild my ankle. And I followed that up with, and if nobody can rebuild this, what would life as an amputee look like for me now? Like, what's new and what's the best thing going? And he said, well, it just so happened.
Can I interest you in?
He said, we have developed a new amputation protocol, and we haven't tried it out yet.
So listen, I want to point something out here, is that I've been in this office. I've sat where you probably were sitting, across the desk from Hugh, Like, and I when I was watching the documentary, you know, he mentioned like this empathy for you to, you know, this pain that you were going through. But I also was like, I wonder how like sort of like, all right, we got a guy kind of, you know, was rolling through his head at all. Because, yeah, it was simultaneous with this protocol that they had created or were in the midst of creating anyway, to receive a you know, this incredibly advanced, basically bionic leg.
Yeah. So I met with Hugh in January and I said, well, I'm not totally sold on doing an amputation yet. Like I'm not there. I still want to investigate reconstruction. So he introduces me to Matthew Carty, who he has partnered with to develop this new amputation protocol. And I said, I want you to introduce me to the surgeon, but I'm not there yet. Like I want to talk to him about this, but I also want to talk about reconstruction. So when I met with Matthew Carty, I think I met in March of 2016. This guy is the absolute best doctor I have ever met in my entire fucking life. And unfortunately, I've met a lot of doctors. and I say unfortunately because they're usually putting me back together or fixing me or whatever. He was the first doctor that I talked to who did not have his hand on the doorknob waiting to leave when I started talking. He sat with me for probably 2 hours, all about the possibilities of what to do with my ankle. Like, is it salvageable? And then all the questions I had about amputation. And then actually we even talked about possible transplantation, taking a donated ankle from a cadaver and transplanting it onto me. And he said that in itself would be considered experimental and first of its kind, is having an elective amputation and transplant of a limb. Because normally they save limbs, transplantable limbs, for people who've already been amputated, and trying to improve their life. So we talked a lot about a lot of things, and going forward, the plan was, all right, he will book me an appointment with the best foot and ankle surgeons in Boston. Book me appointments with the best neurologists who can investigate the damaged nerves in Boston. And these guys are all super duper world-class surgeons in their fields. And the orthopedic surgeon that I met with looked at my CTs, he looked at my ankle, and he said, well, I typically like to give people 3 options. And, your first option is to do nothing, which obviously is not much of an option. Second option is we can do fusions, but he said, I would want to do all of the fusions all at once because it'll just save you time in dealing with multiple surgeries and eventual possibility of collapse of the bone and stuff. And then the third option would be amputation. So I took that information. Oh, and then I went to a neurologist who did a bunch of tests on the nerves down my left leg and in my foot, trying to determine where the damage was and if it could be repaired. And they could not isolate where the damage was, and in order to isolate it, they said they would have to do that surgically, and in that process they would just fuck things up beyond repair. He said it's just not worth hunting for this. So that was kind of the answer. Like, all right, well, the nerves can't be fixed, the bones can't be fixed. Let's go. Let's get rid of this thing. So yeah, so I made that decision. Kind of all of the repair options and other options just kind of were not panning out, and I just started thinking about what is going to get me back to being active. What is going to get me the best quality of life? I was 51, and I was like, how many more years can I get in if I'm going in to have my ankle repaired every couple of years? Like I need this just to be one and done. Once I kind of made that decision, like, all right, well, let's just go ahead with this. we put it on the schedule, but it was several months out. So it was scheduled for July of 2016. So this is actually like 6 months from the time that I talked to Hugh about amputation that we scheduled the surgery. Leading up to scheduling that, there was a lot of meetings with Hugh's research, his grad students. This one guy in particular, Tyler Kleitz, was a PhD candidate, and he was the one working on this the most. He actually designed a lot of the surgery protocol. You know, there were trips to the lab to do a bunch of pre-amputation testing. There was a bunch of trips to Boston for being evaluated for pre-op evaluations and all this stuff. And in the meantime,
I want to ask you a question about that, because this team, and I've in the documentary, I mean, they're so young. Like, yeah, it's just, it's wild. I mean, they are like the best of the best, right? As far as what they do. Yes. But it's just Hugh's not young, but he's sort of just there, like overseeing it, and the people doing the work. These researchers, like this gentleman Tyler that you were talking about, like, it's crazy. Yeah, in the hands of these like youngsters. Yeah, but it was cool. Tyler
is a pretty amazing individual. He's now he's a professor of physics and engineering at UCLA now, I think. Yeah, Hugh is guiding these research students, these grad students, and he's just kind of overseeing all of this. And actually, I was not supposed to be the first patient. I buried the lead there. So I ended up being the first patient for this new protocol, but I wasn't supposed to be. And it was maybe a month or two ahead of the surgery date. The surgeon called me and he said, we had the other patient has dropped out, and so you're now into the first slot. And he said, are you okay with that? And I was like, honestly, it makes no difference to me. Like, the thought of amputating my leg is fucking terrifying enough that it doesn't matter to me if I'm first or second. It's not more terrifying to go first. And I had that confidence about this right from the beginning. I was like, sure, this is experimental, but if it goes wrong, what's the worst that can happen? Like, I could be in agony for however long it takes them to undo it. And to me, I'd already been through a year and a half of excruciating, debilitating pain, like the worst pain of my life. So it can't possibly get worse from there.
Well, and to fill in this blank real quick is, we've been talking about this protocol, but the idea, we don't have to go into the details of that, because that's on a whole other, biomechanics podcast.
I'm actually really good. I can give you a quick synopsis of that. Like,
just to fill us in about why this is so special.
So
they're not just lopping your foot off.
Right. So what's special about this is, so we've all seen the amazing robotic prosthetics that are out there. They're always, kind of touting these things when somebody develops some new one. But the problem is the actual control of them has been relatively unsatisfying and unsatisfactory for the end users. They don't have great control over them. And it's a lot of times the control has to be, they've got to use AI or some, sophisticated software to make these things work correctly. And the end user, it doesn't feel like their own limb. So this new protocol was designed and intended to bridge that gap and to make them feel more natural and more part of you. And it's very super, super simple. I mean, it sounds like science fiction sort of stuff, but it's super simple. So every joint in our body has an agonist-antagonist pair of muscles, right? So, you have your tricep and your bicep. Your tricep contracts, your bicep stretches. Your bicep contracts, your tricep stretches. That gives your brain, your nervous system, lots of information about the position of your hand in space without looking at it. And the medical world and PT world calls that proprioception. It's the ability to close your eyes and touch your nose without seeing it. So in traditional amputation, that agonist-antagonist relationship is destroyed. If you cut off an arm across the humerus, you no longer have the bicep and tricep talking to each other. So you lose that proprioception in that limb. And if you have a prosthetic limb on there, that proprioception doesn't come back. It's gone because those muscles aren't talking to each other. So in my case, they took 2 pair of muscles that control the ankle that do your plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, inversion, eversion. They connected those through little pulleys that they built on my tibia and mounted there. So now my brain thinks that my foot is still there and that it can control it. And so I still can plantar flex in my mind. I'm moving my ghost foot around, plantar flex, dorsiflex, invert, evert. Then when I have these robot prosthetics connected to me, they are attached to my muscles just through surface electrodes and just picking up the myoelectric signals from those muscles. Then it goes into a computer, and the computer tries to move the robot accordingly. And what they found was that it worked. So the first tests that we were doing, as probably shown in that documentary Augmented, the first time they actually had it on me and tuned correctly, my brain, my body adopted that robot foot as if oh, hey, your foot is back. We're just going to start using it. And you automatically adopt that component as part of you. And Hugh coined the term neural embodiment, meaning my nervous system said, hey, this is part of us now, let's use it. And so the movement of the foot and the use of the foot was just natural instinct. I was doing some just kind of puttering around in the lab wearing the robot, and I noticed that as I lifted my knee to go up these stairs, that the foot would automatically toe up. And if you think about this now, when you go upstairs, you automatically lift your toes without thinking about it to clear the step. And when you turn around and you come back down the stairs, you automatically, without thinking about it, you reach for the step as you step down. And the robot was doing those things without me really intending it to. It was just doing it automatically. And I said, hey, guys, look at this. And they're like, what? And I said, the foot, it's doing these things as I'm going up and down these stairs, and it's doing it all on its own. I'm not consciously thinking about this. It's just doing it. And that was kind of the moment where they're like, wow, this is actually working better than they had hoped. And I remember that day in the lab because everybody, the lab is full of research grad students, all working on their various things. Everybody in the lab had stopped working, and they were all, you've been in that lab, there's like the mezzanine up above. Everyone's just all watching what's going on down there, because this was a moment that they had been working towards for several years in creating these new prosthetics. So it was kind of a big moment, and the documentary team was there at the time. Honey, come here. Sorry.
That's okay.
To me.
Pop her up in your lap again.
Yeah. Hey, come. Good girl. Up. There you go. Chill.
She'll be happy there.
So
I mean, what were your emotions? I mean, was it at that moment? Was it later? What
at that
were your
moment?
emotions
It was.
about
I was
this
not
thing?
emotional. I was like, "Oh, this is all really cool. This is fun." But then driving home that night, so I have from the lab. It's a 2-hour drive to my house in Maine, and I was like, "Holy shit!" This was kind of a big thing. I just kind of replaying all of the day's events in my head and remembering. Everybody stopped doing what they were doing. Everybody was watching this. I was like, this was kind of a big moment for the lab. It was a big moment for Hugh. It was a big moment for Tyler because this was his PhD. Yeah, it was like, wow, this is kind of an important big step in the development of these new prosthetics. So
yeah, and like not just for you. Obviously, this is
a
a harbinger that your life is probably going to get better, but it's also this harbinger because I mean these are things that I think they mentioned in there that you know they're partnering with the Department of Defense and things like that for wounded veterans. So this is like a huge move forward for the possibilities for all sorts of people.
Right. So while I was driving home, Hugh called me and he said, "What would you think about a robot foot specifically for climbing?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, that would be cool, but you know, there's probably not much of a market for that. But yeah, that'd be really cool." But what Hugh was probably thinking was this would be a great demonstration of the capabilities of this technology. So he had one of his grad students she was a master's degree candidate, I think, for mechanical engineering. And she created the climbing foot that was shown in the documentary. So I went back to Cayman Brock and went climbing on the sea cliff there with this robot foot designed specifically for climbing. And so it was like there's just been kind of those moments ever since then, ever since the surgery. Like everything is like this milestone moment. It's been
and there's
crazy wild ride.
Still keep thinking about this like fatefulness of being friends with Hugh, you know, before he was this person. Because when you were friends with him, you know, he was wearing prosthesis, many of which he just made like literally like in probably one of the rooms in one of those shacks that you guys lived in.
Yeah. And
he was not this professor.
Right. And the sockets that he had back then, those things were junk and they weighed a ton. And
right.
The technology. But
then he's a climber. You know, like the multiverse that we happen to live in, that the most prominent creator of hand and leg prosthesis happens to be a climber, you know? It's just like bizarre. And that this is a priority to him and has been since he lost his legs. And so it's just like this crazy system of like that ended up you with a climbing foot that works.
The serendipity of it.
Yes.
And so when the documentary crew started proposing to us about doing this documentary, they didn't know that Hugh and I were roommates back in the day. And so as they kind of were digging into the various aspects of the whole story, they're like, "Wait, what? You guys you knew each other before this? Like what?" And we've done all these other sort of news casting stories. There was HBO Real Sports with Bryant Gumbel. Like I got interviewed and got to hang out with Soledad O'Brien. I don't know if you know who she is or.
Oh yeah, of course.
She's an amazing person. She was really fun to hang out with, fun to talk with. So we did a piece on that. But their crew would be like, "Wait, you guys were roommates? Like you knew each other before this? Like how has all this happened?" And every article, every news article about it, they're all that same sort of thing. That, wait a minute, what?
In the film, and they show you going back to Cayman Brock, which obviously would have been, you know, pretty emotional. But it was
hold on.
Circle.
Let me stop you there.
Okay.
Everybody says that, the whole going back to Cayman Islands. I'm not wired that way. Like, I took the film crew, the documentary crew, to the site of the accident, and they kept asking me, like, "Are you okay? Like, is this scary for you? Is this emotional for you?" And I'm like, "No, the cliff is just this inanimate object. It has no malice towards me. It's not going to attack me." And I actually have no PTSD about the accident. I have loads of PTSD about my time in the hospital in Florida, because that was fucking horrific. But the accident was, it was what it was, and I don't have any big emotions.
Were the film crew
about
like, could you pretend?
Yeah, they kind of often wanted that stuff. Yeah. But my wife, my kid will tell you that I'm just not wired that way. I don't know what it is. I don't experience things the same way that ordinary people do. Well, I don't have that same.
Let's talk about your climbing life after. You know, you've decided that, like you said, when you were like, I only have this much time left to be an active climber, to be an active person. I'm going to go for it. And one of the things, you know, your sometimes partner Mo told me is that, yeah, you're sort of the instigator to get bigger and bigger things done, and you've inspired her to do the same to a certain extent. So tell me about your climbing life after this happened.
So I should clarify that I don't get to use that climbing foot except for special occasions. It's strictly still prototype, and honestly, it's fun to climb with, and it's fun to feel like I have my foot back there, but it's too fragile to climb with regularly and too heavy, and the battery life is really not sufficient. When we filmed the documentary in the Cayman Islands, I went through probably a dozen batteries during just a 2-day filming on one climb.
So it's not quite ready for prime time.
Right.
So if that's the Lamborghini foot, what is your Tacoma everyday I'm wearing?
My everyday foot is actually what I'm wearing now, which is a standard. It has a sock on it at the moment because I've been wearing boots out in the barn. But this is, you know, a standard prosthesis. It kind of looks a bit like a running blade, and you know, it's very multi-sport, multi-terrain possibility. Standard socket. Although actually, I have my sockets kind of specially cut down in weight. Like I want the bare minimum amount of bulk and weight on this thing. So when I go climbing on my own, it's nice and light and suitable for that sort of stuff. I actually started climbing again before amputation, and that was part of my motivation for choosing amputation, was that climbing was so fucking painful. Like everything was painful. The slightest bump of my foot on anything, on a foothold, or if I just banged it on the wall, would just send me. Like it was, a couple of times I actually threw up. It was so painful. So after amputation, before I even received my first prosthesis, I went climbing. I was climbing in the gym, and I felt so liberated because I no longer had to be concerned with bumping my foot on anything. I could, you know, wave my leg all around, whatever, and couldn't be hurt. And I actually found myself, once again, I was like, I'm free to dyno up the wall and not worry about bumping my foot. Once I got a prosthetic, I went through several phases of kind of making my own feet out of wooden blocks, or doing the old Hugh Herr style, which was taking this old type of foot called a Sach foot, which is actually an acronym for solid ankle cushioned heel. It's a really old school foot, but it actually works pretty well as a climbing foot if you cut off the toes and shave it all down and glue climbing shoe rubber to it. And that works pretty well.
Out in the garage, right?
Yep, out in the garage. And honestly, you know, the foot that Malcolm Daly developed, it was modeled after that. Like the geometry is still pretty similar to the old Sach foot, Hugh Herr Sach foot thing. So once I kind of sorted out the feet things, I eventually settled on a Sach foot that I would shave down and cram a child's size climbing shoe onto it, and that worked really well. I currently climb with a custom-made carbon fiber thing with hockey pucks that works really, really well, and that's what I use full-time now. Edges, You mortals could never edge like these things can edge.
Yeah, now you're sounding like Hugh.
Yeah,
you're better. We've made improvements.
There's sometimes it feels like cheating. Like I can kind of sink onto a hold, sink all of my weight into my socket, and just kind of rest and shake out there. Whereas you normal people your calves would be burning. You'd be swapping your feet trying to rest. So once I got kind of my climbing groove back, I started thinking, all right, well, what do people do after a near-death experience and you get a second lease on life? Like, you start looking for the old bucket list things. What were some of the things that I always wanted to do but never got around to? And Lotus Flower Tower was definitely one of those that I felt like I really want to get up there and give that a go. But I somehow thought it needs to be an all-adaptive sort of thing. Some of these need to be all-adaptive. The reason I feel that way is generally when the general public sees an adaptive person doing anything, particularly climbing, it's automatically assumed that that person has been guided up this thing, or somebody else did all the work, somebody else did all the heavy lifting, and you're just along for the ride. And I didn't want to be accused of that. I want to make the statement that we can do these things entirely on our own. So I asked Malcolm Dahlia, like, who would be some good potential partners for this? And he mentioned, well, I already knew Craig. He couldn't go at the time. He mentioned Mo, and he mentioned a couple other people. And so I messaged all these people that he mentioned, and Mo was the only one to answer me. And I hadn't really met Mo, but I had seen her climbing at a paraclimbing event in Boston. Maybe I'd already had my accident, or maybe I'd already had the amputation. But I hadn't really, at that point, I had not made any plans to go do any big things like the Lotus Flower Tower. So Mo said, yeah, sure. But then also, like, internet stalked me to make sure I wasn't some sort of a creeper that she would regret ever crossing paths with. And we made a plan to meet and climb together in Vegas, like over Christmas. And that was Christmas of 2017, I think. Picked her up at the airport. We drove out to the Loop Road and went to go do Birdland. Is that the really popular, like 5-7 or something out there?
Doesn't matter.
I can't remember. I think it's Birdland. Anyway, and so I give her the rack, but I give her an 80s climber trad rack. And I'm like, okay, here you go. There's like, I think there's like 4 cams and a rack of wires on there. And she's like, what? This is it? Holy shit. But anyway, she starts off and she's climbing up, and there's, of course, it's a popular route, so there's other parties above. And they're wrapping down, and this guy just sees Mo climbing with her taped up stump, and he goes, what happened to your hand? And Mo didn't even look up at the guy. She just said, alligators, like, and just kept on climbing. And I was like, man, this is awesome. Like, this is perfect. We're going to get along just fine. Like, this is my kind of humor. So the whole rest of that trip, like, we climbed for several more days. The whole rest of that trip, we were joking about that we were in Vegas for the Alligator Survivors Support convention. We're here for the ass convention. It was good. And we've kind of been pretty regular climbing partners ever since. I think probably since that day, I've climbed more pitches with Mo in all of these years than with anyone else. Like, even my local climbing buddies that I climb with all the time, I've climbed more with her than anyone. We've now done 3 kind of biggish alpine trips together.
People can go back and listen to Mo. Mo recounts the Lotus Flower Tower pretty well. Sound pretty miserable. actually.
Yeah.
A lot of rain.
A lot of rain.
A lot of sketchiness.
Well, and in retrospect, I made a complacency error. I drank some water at the base of the tower that was like running on the surface of the glacier or something. The next day, which was, summit day, the upper half of the Lotus Flower Tower, I woke up and I was like, I don't feel good. And then proceeded to continue up the route, just throwing up all over myself for 10 pitches. It was rough. Yeah, it was really rough. And eventually, we wanted to do it unassisted, but I reached a point where I've lost too much. I've just lost too much. I was weak and shaky and throwing up, and so we latched on to the film crew's fixed line for a couple of pitches, 3 pitches, and then we climbed the last pitch. Actually, Mo climbed the last pitch, I think, following the fixed line, but not jugging it. And then I top roped the last pitch. Then we got the hell out of there.
Yeah, I mean, these things happen to everybody, these types of things. But, when you put yourself in front of this challenge, this specific challenge, I mean, you obviously have to think over these decisions, but it seems like a few different circumstances forced your hand. I mean, are you okay with that in the end, or
I would like to go back and tick it off.
Is there a disappointment?
It was definitely disappointing. We still, we summited. It was just not unassisted, and by unassisted, I mean Mo and I doing all of the work. So, I would love to go back there and actually maybe climb some other stuff, but that place is the back end of beyond. It's not an easy place to get to. It's expensive to get to.
Did you guys use a helicopter?
We used a plane and a helicopter going in because there was 4 of us. There was me and Mo, and then the film crew, which was Pat and Taylor. And the 4 of us went in the helicopter, but not all of our gear could go in the helicopter.
Right.
So there was another crew going in at the same time. They flew into the lake with the plane, dropped all the gear off, and then after the helicopter dropped us off, went down to the lake, picked up the other crew and the rest of our gear and brought it on up. Yeah.
We did the exact same thing.
It's
exactly. Yeah.
Honestly,
and then had the helicopter sling our stuff up. Yeah.
Yeah. It feels a little bit like cheating. So we just did that in the Bugaboos. We went and flew a helicopter into East Creek, but let's be fair, I'm a fucking cripple. And hiking that shit in for, that distance, those loads, it fucks up my stump something fierce. And then I have to take a few days off to let everything heal afterwards. So the helicopter is, I don't know, it's a necessary evil, I guess. So we just did, myself and 3 others, Mo, Nat, and Sinead, did a all adaptive ascent of the Becky Chenard in the Bugaboos, and we're pretty happy with that. We were pretty psyched to have flown in there. Like, you get dropped off, and you're like, with almost no effort, you're in the middle of nowhere. You're all by yourselves. It's kind of an awesome feeling.
We've talked about you and Maxine. What about your wife? She's lived through this. It's not easy in her own involvement.
It's cliche to say, but she's been my rock through all of this. She, saved my life literally multiple times through all of this. I'm fortunate that she has the nursing background, that she's a nurse. But also I'm fortunate that she's an incredibly compassionate, empathetic person. She actually, she was kind of stressed through my recovery, not recovery of amputation, stressed through the recovery of the accident, and was actually thinking of leaving me because I had become so depressed and grouchy and, just become an incredible miserable asshole. And I was simultaneously plotting my departure from this world and repairing my ankle. I was doing both things at the same time. And I confessed to her that I was Like I feel like I just want to end it. I can't live like this, because the doctors were just giving me more and more opioids to deal with the pain, and I just didn't want to take them and couldn't live like that. So when I told her that I was feeling suicidal, she made me, sat there while I booked an appointment for my primary care physician, went to the appointment with me to make sure that I told my primary care that that's what I was thinking, and stayed with me while I made appointments for therapy and got on medication and went through that whole process. And she stuck it out. She went through hell through all of this. I couldn't have blamed her for leaving me at those times, and yet she's stuck it all out anyway. And now she's a travel nurse, so she was in Arizona for last year, and this year she and Maxine are in Rapid City, South Dakota.
Let's get towards the end here.
Okay.
Maybe some reflection time. It seems like, I don't know if this is connected, but, you're talking about how going back to Cayman Brock, to the scene of the crime, so to speak, is not really something that bothers you, but what about like
I've done that
someone
route, I've done the route twice since.
Okay, cool.
No
what
falls.
About like
I can still say I never weighted the rope.
Oh. Yeah, okay. I don't know. Deeper story there. But so what about like someone, being reflective? So you've been, like you said, you had whatever PTSD, whatever trauma came out of it was part of this hospital experience, this pain experience. Your daughter, Maxine, obviously went through that as well, and you were part of that as their parent. And then also, you were on the forefront of this research, maybe by accident, but nevertheless part of this research that's going to help, and is actually, gone on to help a lot of people. The literal amputation style below the knee there is named after you. It's the Ewing procedure or whatever. And
I'll forever be
out there.
known for my ability to lose body parts.
Right. So, I mean, the experience now is how far out? I mean, how old are you now?
I'm 60 now. And
okay. So it's 10 years out almost.
It'll be 10 years this December since the accident. As for reflection, I sometimes talk to Maxine about this, because there's times when, we still, they and I have to still kind of process this whole accident thing and each other's involvement. And, Maxine was 13, so absolutely 100% not their fault. This was entirely my oversight, my complacency. And so, in talking about this with them, I once said, and I don't take it back, even if this was your fault, it's not, 100% not. But even if it was, look at what has come out of this. Like, I am not unhappy about the way this has all played out. I've gotten to play a kind of a big part in this research. We've seen this huge advancement in robotic prosthetic technology. I've gotten to get involved with other paraclimbers like Mo and Craig and the Adaptive Climbers Fest. And I also do a lot of, I can't say it's counseling because I'm not a licensed counselor or anything, but I do a lot of talking with people contemplating amputation or recent amputees, and kind of helping them through this process, kind of taking what Craig did for me and, passing that on. And it's kind of led me down some pretty amazing opportunities to give back to the climbing community. That kind of, the climbing community, this is a slight political statement, but this country is so fucked up with our healthcare that every time somebody gets hurt, there's a GoFundMe. But the climbing community set up a GoFundMe for me, and really helped me out when I was out of work for several months and had a lot of medical bills. And so So all my contributions to this new research is kind of my giving back. And the coaching or counseling of potential amputees, new amputees, is giving back. It's not something I ever saw myself doing, but I'm happy and proud to be doing it. Sometimes it's really tough because I'm the leader of the Ewing amputees of sorts, the de facto leader. And when I meet new amputees or somebody contemplating amputee and we start sharing our trauma, those are emotional moments. Like it's hard not to break down and cry when you know exactly what they're feeling, what they're going through, the struggle. It's not an easy thing, but I'm happy to do it. Like well, in some ways it's an honor to be able to help people in that way.
All right, folks, thanks for listening, and thanks to Jim for telling that story. Quite an intense arc of his life. If you want to follow Jim, he's over at Instagram at Jim Ewing. He's very involved in the adaptive climbing community, the paraclimbing community. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, go check him out. It's got a really cute dog, too, that you heard in the interview. There's some pictures of the dog. Also, if you're interested in more about Hugh Herr, you can go back to my interview. Number 148, Never Broken is the name of that one. A little bit awkward, I'll admit. He's kind of an intense guy. I think I got outbrained by him. But anyhow, it's a pretty good interview. It's not terrible. Let me just say that. But there's lots out there about Hugh. Fascinating guy, worth a listen. 148 Enormocast. Also, I'll link to that Nova documentary Augmented about Jim and Hugh on the website, enormocast.com. Do you ever go to the website? Yeah, probably not. Anyway, we're leaving September into Rocktober. It's magnificent here in Colorado. I hope it's great where you are too, and don't forget to check your knots and where the rope is in relationship to the gree-gree.
I was lucky to have Hugh Herr as my guide. Although only 18, he's considered one of the top rock climbers on the East Coast and certainly one of the best in the world. What went through your mind when the doctor told you were going to lose your legs?
Same thing Jeff said to his doctor, let's get rid of him. Get rid of my foot. That's what it comes down to. Let's get on with life.
You called yourself the mechanical boy down there. Why?
Just the different feet. You can change yourself, make yourself taller, shorter. Mechanical. You can be mechanical, adjustable.
You've gotten very creative with them, too. I was noticing these.
I think it's the wave of the future. Man working to adapt better.
I think you're terrific.
The teachers told me that's where it's at.